Section 1. The Call of Abraham. In those distant lands, where the desert was not merely a landscape but a living, breathing entity, a severe and eternal witness to the fleeting nature of human life, the sun's reflections shimmered upon the golden sands. This was the land of Canaan, which had welcomed Abraham, a man whose past lay thousands of miles away in the opulent Ur of the Chaldees, and whose future had been promised by God himself. Abraham, the patriarch, whose heart beat to the rhythm of faith, filled with both incomprehensible hope and a hidden, almost forbidden fear, knew that every step he took, every tent peg he drove, every breath of his livestock was charged not merely with life's necessity, but with the irrevocable will of God. He was old, his skin like parchment, marked by the history of long migrations, and his wise eyes saw not only the visible horizon, but also the unseen contours of the future nation destined to spring from his advanced years. His son, Isaac, was more than just an heir. He was the living, warm, smiling proof that God was not only thunder and voice, but also boundless, wondrous mercy. Isaac was born after decades of barren waiting. He was the crown of faith, the very essence of God's faithfulness. When Abraham looked upon him, he saw not only a son, but also the stars God had promised him, innumerable like the sand on the seashore. Isaac was his heart, his future, his smile amid the desert's harshness. And that is why what happened that morning was not merely a test. It was a rupture of matter, a fracture of time, an apocalypse compressed into a single moment. One morning, when the dawn was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose, mother of pearl and gold, and the morning chill still clung to the shadow of the great tent, the Lord spoke to Abraham. It was not thunder, nor storm, nor a vision blazing before his eyes. It was a voice that pierced all barriers, through flesh and bone itself, through all senses, settling directly upon the crystal-clear plate of his soul. In the silence of his tent, this voice sounded like the loudest cry in the universe, though the surrounding servants and Sarah heard nothing but the usual morning noise. Abraham! Abraham! Twice to gain attention, twice to leave no room for doubt. The patriarch, accustomed to dialogue with the divine, replied, "Here I am," firmly, with a submission that had become second nature to him. And then came the words that would cleave his world into before and after. "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." These words were like white-hot iron poured into his flesh. Abraham's heart constricted, not just from pain or horror. It stopped, and then began to beat with such inhuman force that it seemed ready to burst from his chest. His mind, accustomed to complex decisions, could not process this equation. How could the source of life, the witness of my faith, who himself granted me this son as proof of his promises, demand his destruction? In that moment, all his theology, all his logic, all his built-up faith collapsed. This was not just a test of obedience. It was a test of the essential understanding of God. For a few long, unending minutes, Abraham stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the spot where Isaac had been sitting just moments before, innocently playing with a carved wooden toy. The inner space of his soul transformed into a battleground of titans. On one side, the voice of the flesh, the cry of paternal love, the whisper of betrayal, which screamed about impossibility, absurdity, and the ruin of all hopes. And on the other side, the voice that was the source of his very existence, the source of all promises. He knew that listening to God was the only path of faith, but this path now led through the unknown, through a bloody fog, through an abyss at the bottom of which lay his only son. Why not refuse? Why not cry out? Because Abraham knew if he refused to sacrifice the son he loved, he would refuse the God he loved more. He would refuse all his history, all his journeys, all his promises. This was the price of absolute faith. And, gritting his teeth until his jaw trembled, Abraham made this inhuman decision. He made it in complete, icy solitude, speaking not a word to his wife, lest he shatter her faith, and not a word to Isaac, lest he kill his hope even before leaving home. The decision was made. Trembling, he began to gather the wood. Section 2. The Journey of Faith. The morning, which began with a pledge of loyalty, turned into a day that was to be the longest in Abraham's life. A day of trial stretched over 3 endless nights and days. As soon as the first rays of the sun touched the earth, and the shadows of the tents abruptly shortened, the patriarch, allowing himself no time for delay or reflection, began to act. It was a mechanical, almost ritualistic movement. He took Isaac, 2 young servants, to carry extra supplies and perhaps to have witnesses or sympathizers, he wasn't sure which, and loaded the donkey with wood, a cleaver, and a container for fire. The wood, which was the object of his maniacal attention, was carefully selected. Dry, thick, ready for complete, irreversible consumption. And he set out on the long journey to Mount Moriah, a name unknown to him until that morning. But now it was engraved in his consciousness as the epicenter of his destiny. The road was hard. The ruthless, hot desert wind flung sand into his face, as if nature itself protested against his intention. Every step was not merely a physical exertion, but a hammer blow to Abraham's fragile soul. His heart beat not to the rhythm of his walking, but to the countdown of time, relentlessly drawing him closer to the most terrible act. And beside him walked Isaac. Isaac, the son of the promise, the son of his old age, whose eyes shone with childish innocence, unaware of the trial that awaited him. The boy walked easily, with youthful vigor, occasionally trying to talk to his father about familiar things, the quality of the pastures, the upcoming date harvest. But Abraham was silent. His silence was not merely the absence of words. It was a thick, impenetrable wall, erected around his pain so as not to shatter his son's fragile world. He could not speak because he feared his voice would break, and an unrestrained cry of despair would burst forth, betraying their tragic mission. 3 days, 3 nights of silent, slow marching, in which the past seemed unattainable and the future unbearably close. Abraham prayed silently. Every step was a silent, exhausting prayer. God, if you are leading me, grant me the strength to carry out your will. If you take him away, how will you then fulfill your promise? If I kill him, how will I then become the father of a great nation? Do you not intend to resurrect him, so that your will may be fulfilled in him? Is this not the ultimate act preceding an unheard-of miracle? His thoughts intertwined fear and hope into a tight, suffocating knot. He clung to the only logical thread he could follow. If God, the source of life, demands his sacrifice, it can only mean one thing. God is capable of restoring him to life. Otherwise, the promise would be rendered null and void. It was on the 3rd day, as the grim, majestic peak, marked by God's own finger, emerged from the horizon, that what Abraham had foreseen happened. Isaac, as if waking from a long, sweet dream in which he still saw himself alive, spoke, interrupting the dense silence of the desert. "My father!" He addressed him, and the word father sounded to Abraham like a death knell. "Here I am, my son," Abraham replied, his voice dry, like the sand he had just swallowed. "Here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" The question was simple, logical, and innocent, but it tore the veil of silence. It was a direct, piercing arrow to the heart. All the tension of the 3 days reached its climax. Abraham stopped. He turned to his son, his eyes held an abyss. Finally, the words that were an attempt to both tell the truth and shield his son from horror burst from him. "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." The word provide, Yahweh Yireh, was a prophecy wrested from the very heart of faith. It was the last, desperate refuge from madness. It was an admission that he was going not to kill, but to return. Isaac, hearing this, asked no more questions. He accepted these words as the final truth, as God's plan. He, the child, became at that moment the first prophet to believe in his own substitution. And they walked on. But now Isaac carried not only the wood, but also the burden of understanding. They walked together, alone, conquering the last few feet until they reached the base. Section 3. Arrival at the mountain. Finally, after 3 days that felt like 3 centuries of exhausting torment, they reached the place. Mount Moriah stood before them, not merely as a stone massif, but as a majestic, ruthless throne for the execution of God's will. Its summit was bare, stark, and seemed closer to heaven than to earth. It was a place with nothing extraneous, only space for the meeting of man and God. Abraham raised his hand to stop his servants, who still walked behind them like gray shadows. He said, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there and worship, and then we will come back to you." The words, "come back to you," were not just instructions. They were the vibration of his final, unbroken faith. He did not merely hope to return with Isaac. He knew that God had to either resurrect his son or provide a substitute. Otherwise, his promise would be void. Abraham deliberately left the witnesses at a sufficient distance so that their fear or intervention would not disrupt the sacred, inhuman act. He cut the ropes and handed the wood to Isaac. The son, unknowingly, carried not just a load of timber, but the symbol of his own destiny, the instrument of his own sacrifice. Abraham took the cleaver and the fire, the tools and means of destruction. They began the ascent. The climb was difficult, the stones crumbled, but this physical pain was nothing compared to the weight on his soul. On the summit, an icy, epic silence reigned. The wind whispered, but carried no sound from the valley. They were here, at the edge of the universe, separated from everything human. Abraham surveyed the summit and, finding a natural stone slab, began to build the altar. Every stone he lifted and placed was laid with the meticulousness of an architect building, not a place of execution, but a bridge between earth and heaven. It was construction against logic, against love, but in absolute obedience. When the altar was ready, symmetrical, stable, ready to receive its burden, the time arrived for which they had traveled for 3 days. Abraham arranged the wood. Its scent, dry and sharp, filled the air. Isaac stood nearby. He saw his father's readiness, but saw no lamb. His innocent yet perceptive heart began to grasp the truth. Perhaps he recalled his father's words, "God will provide." Abraham led Isaac to the altar. He, the great patriarch, could not look his son in the eyes, for he feared that the piercing, trusting gaze would break his resolve. Isaac, the son who saw all the magnitude of his father's faith, did not resist. Without a word, without a single groan, he allowed his father to bind him. Perhaps in that moment, Isaac understood. If God takes, it is only to give something incomparably greater. He trusted not so much fate as his father's faith. Abraham's hands, full of trembling, carefully bound his son's wrists and ankles, as if he were swaddling him for sleep, rather than preparing him for a burnt offering. Every knot was a knot of struggle, every movement an internal groan. Then he lifted his son and placed him on the altar upon the wood. Isaac lay there, face toward the sky, as if addressing God, a living, silent offering. This was not a scene of violence. It was the culmination of love, juxtaposed with obedience. Abraham stood over him. He took the cleaver, the heavy, cold metal. His hand, which had cut bread thousands of times, embraced Sarah, and blessed his servants, was now raised for the most terrible task. He closed his eyes so as not to see his son's face, and in his soul, the final, "Farewell, my hope. May God himself take care of his promise," rang out. Section 4. The Voice of God. When Abraham raised the knife, that shining, cold, ruthless symbol of irreversible action, time seemed to stop. On Mount Moriah, upon that solitary stone altar, the fate of Isaac, the destiny of the entire world, and the whole logic of this covenant were being decided. The universe paused. Every atom, every ray of light, every note of the wind stood still, awaiting the final chord. Abraham's arm, taut like a bowstring, hung in the air. It trembled not from physical effort, but from the inner, superhuman tension, as paternal love and absolute faith fought for possession of his will. His heart was seized by a feeling of such intense, unbearable presence of God that it seemed the very rock on which the altar stood pulsed under the weight of his glory. It was not silence, it was the fullness of silence, where everything noisy, human, and unnecessary retreated, making space for the voice. From the heavens, not just a word rang out. The voice of the angel of the Lord sounded, an echo of the Creator himself, loud as a trumpet, yet gentle as the first rain on dry earth. It pierced the space, shattering the fragility of the moment. "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." These words fell upon Abraham's upraised hand like an invisible yet insurmountable barrier. His muscles instantly relaxed. The knife, slipping from his numb fingers, fell onto the stones with a dull clang. The world, which had just been cleaved, began to reassemble. The phrase, "now I know," was the deepest and most dramatic part of the revelation. Of course, the Almighty knew Abraham's intention even before he left his tent. But "now I know" was not spoken for God, but for Abraham. It was a public declaration of his faith before heaven and earth. God proclaimed Abraham's faith had passed the test of absolute purity. It was an acknowledgement that there was no attachment, no wealth, no desire he placed above God's will, even if the price was his most cherished promise. Abraham slowly raised his eyes, blinded by tears that burst from the icy shell of his heart. Mount Moriah, just moments ago the place of death, was transformed into the place of salvation, the sacred theater of divine intervention. His gaze caught a movement. In a nearby thicket of horns, a ram was entangled. This was no accidental beast. It was there, a step away from the altar, exactly when it was needed. It was the lamb whom God provided, just as Abraham himself had prophesied 3 days ago. This was God's answer to the prayer uttered in the silence of the desert. My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. This ram became a symbol of absolute faith and obedience, the guarantee of the covenant. Its horns, entangled in the thorns, symbolized substitution, the idea of a redemptive sacrifice. God provided a replacement, a symbol of faith and obedience that confirmed that his will lay not in destruction, but in redemption. The trial was over. Isaac's life, his future, the destiny of an entire nation were returned. Section 5. The sacrifice completed. The moment that followed the falling of the knife was filled with an overwhelming, all-consuming relief that flooded Abraham, like water bursting through a dam. His heart, so recently torn apart, began to heal, pulsating in a new rhythm, the rhythm of joyful gratitude. He rushed to Isaac. His hands, which moments ago were preparing for a fatal blow, now carefully, trembling with emotional shock, untied the knots. By untying the ropes, he was not merely freeing his son from bonds. He was releasing him for life, for the future, for the promise. Isaac rose. He was alive. He looked at his father with absolute, unbroken trust, his eyes filled with the understanding that he was chosen and that his life had been saved not by human will, but by a divine miracle. Father and son embraced. This hug was not just a reunion after a long separation. It was the merging of two souls who had passed through a shared, inhuman ordeal, through death and resurrection. They wept, but these were tears bitter from the recently endured horror, yet sweet with the inexpressible, wondrous joy of salvation. Abraham, regaining his composure, led his son to the ram, whose horns were firmly caught in the thicket. The ram offered no resistance, as if aware of its redemptive mission. It was the ideal substitution, life for a life, given not for righteousness, but for faithfulness. Abraham took the ram and, performing the appropriate rituals, offered it as a sacrifice on the altar instead of his son. The fire that was meant to consume Isaac now consumed the ram's body, sending the smoke of the burnt offering up to the heavens as the aroma of absolute obedience. As the fire subsided, the voice of the angel of the Lord sounded again, this time not as a halt, but as a proclamation of the covenant, a solemn oath that could not be changed. By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Heaven echoed with the blessings of the Lord. This was not merely a reward. It was the confirmation of a universal heritage. Abraham had proven himself worthy for God's mercy to be extended to all humanity through his family. His obedience became the catalyst for the unfolding of God's plan. Abraham named the place Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will see, or the Lord will provide, inscribing the memory of the miracle into the stone. This name became a symbol. On Mount Moriah, in the moment of extreme need, God provided the perfect solution. This trial, which began as an act of destruction, became the proof of Abraham's great faith, his uncompromising devotion, and, most importantly, God's profound mercy. Section 6. The Legacy of Faith. Abraham and Isaac descended from Mount Moriah. Their steps, which 3 days ago were burdened with horror and uncertainty, were now light, as if they were treading on air. They were not simply returning home. They were returning with a new reality, with a new understanding of God. Engraved on Isaac's face, who had just experienced his own symbolic death and resurrection, was not childish, carefree innocence, but the seal of eternal, sacrificial wisdom. At the foot of the mountain, where the servants awaited them, there was no need for words. The servants saw two men, the old patriarch and the young heir, who had disappeared from the world and now returned. But they returned transformed. They had been tested by fire, and this experience set them apart. Stepping onto solid ground, Abraham embraced Isaac tightly, and into this embrace, he poured everything he could not say during the 3 days of silence. You are alive. We are free. God is faithful to his word. They returned home to the camp. Their hearts were filled with gratitude, but no longer a blind devotion, but a deep personal covenant, carved out by pain and wonder. Although Scripture does not describe Sarah's reaction, one can only imagine the silent, all-consuming scene when the mother, whose son was oblivious to the danger, suddenly realized she had been an inch away from losing her only heir. Her reaction, her pain, and her subsequent joy became an invisible yet powerful part of this story. This day, the day of the Akedah, the binding, left an indelible mark not only on their souls, but also on the destiny of the entire nation that was to descend from Abraham. The trial of faith became the cornerstone, a symbol of obedience, devotion, and God's blessing for countless generations. The descendants of Israel, Christians, and Muslims all honor Abraham as the father of faith, the man who passed the most severe test. The legacy of this act is multifaceted and eternal, the symbol of obedience. Abraham showed that true faith requires not merely believing in God, but trusting God enough to submit to his will, even when it contradicts human logic. The theology of substitution. The story of the ram caught in the thorns created the prototype of a redemptive sacrifice, laying the foundation for a deeper understanding of God's plan of salvation, where God always provides a substitute to save the chosen person from inevitable doom. The site of the temple. According to later tradition, it was on Mount Moriah that King David later designated the site for the Temple of Jerusalem, and subsequently, Solomon's temple was built there. Thus, the place of the greatest trial of faith was transformed into a sanctuary for the entire world. Therefore, Abraham's trial became not just a historical fact, but an eternal message. This message testifies that the most vital blessings arise only when a person is willing to give God what they value most. When the human I dissolves into God's will, it results not in destruction, but in genuine, boundless rebirth. Moriah is not just a mountain. It is a metaphorical space where everyone who seeks deep faith must leave behind their logic, their doubts, and their most cherished affections to receive in return a new, incomparably greater blessing.